my blissful self. His Holiness Atmananda Swamiji has contributed very important two verses for reflection of bliss. And they are Om Namaha Sukaya. And the other one is Om Namo Nanave. So in the mundane world, one may be rich or the other may be poor. But everyone desires permanent happiness unmixed with misery. But no one is permanently happy without the mixture of misery. But only the self-realized ones are permanently happy. They have attained permanent happiness unmixed with misery. Now let us know in brief about the two verses contributed by His Holiness Atmananda Swamiji. And the one verse is Om Namaha Sukaya. So the meaning of this verse is salutation to happiness. And there is another verse, Om Namo Nanave. The meaning of that verse is salutation to my true self. So usually we think that the sensory objects give us happiness. But the sensory objects usually give us unhappiness. And if we salute to the sensory objects, so we get only unhappiness. And in the same way, the gross body consciousness gives us unhappiness. When we have the gross body consciousness, we experience hunger, thirst, cold, bright sunlight, sultriness, like that. So the gross body consciousness gives us unhappiness. And if we salute to gross body consciousness, it gives us unhappiness only. But generally what people do, the people think that the happiness is in gross body consciousness and it is in the enjoyment of sensory objects. But the enjoyment of sensory objects results into tiresomeness and weariness. As we go on enjoying the sensory objects, the desire to enjoy them increases. It increases gradually and lastly strengthens. But we cannot destroy the desires of sensory objects. But the gross body, which has been in a position to enjoy the sensory objects, becomes diseased. We cannot gratify the desires of sensory objects. There are the sensory organs. For example, the eyes, the nose, the tongue, the skin, and the ears. And there are the respective sensory objects. That is, for the eyes, form. For the nose, the smell. For the tongue, taste. For the skin, the touch. And for the ear, the words. And these sensory organs concerned, that is, the eyes, the nose, the tongue, the skin, the ears. So these are like fire. And their respective sensory objects, that is, the form, the smell, the taste, the skin, the touch, and the words, are just like kerosene or ghee or petrol. So if we pour petrol or kerosene or ghee in the fire, what happens? So there will be increase in the fire. If we see the forms, so the desire to enjoy the forms will be increased like that. As we smell, the desire to smell increases. As we taste, the desire to taste increases. As we touch, the desire to touch increases. And as you listen the words, the desire to hear the words increases. Then if this is the case, how the desires can be destroyed? How the desires can be satisfied? So usually it is impossible to satisfy the desires. So what to do? So we will be in a position to enjoy the sensory objects. When we try to enjoy the sensory objects, from one sensory object we go to the second sensory object. Why? Because in the first sensory object there is no happiness. So to get happiness, we give up the first sensory object and we go to the second sensory object. Later we give up the second sensory object and we go to the third sensory object. And from the third we go to the fourth sensory object. And from the fourth we go to the fifth sensory object. And lastly we go to deep sleep. Why it happens like that? So this clearly indicates that there is no happiness in sensory objects. Usually what we do, we think that some sensory objects give happiness and other sensory objects give unhappiness. Then what we do, we like these sensory objects that we think that they are givers of happiness. And we dislike the sensory objects that we think that they are givers of unhappiness. But the sensory objects themselves have not told that they give happiness or unhappiness. We ourselves have thought that some give happiness and others give unhappiness. Then when we get the sensory object of our liking, our mind becomes calm. And in that calm mind, the happiness of our true self is reflected and experienced. And when we get the sensory object, which is not of our liking, then our mind becomes agitated. And in the agitated mind, the happiness of our true self is not reflected, and the bliss is not experienced in that agitated mind. But we experience a happiness in deep sleep. So the cause for unhappiness is the desires of the sensory objects and the gross body consciousness. In a deep sleep, what happens therein is the gross body consciousness and the desires of sensory objects have been forgotten. They have been given up by forgetfulness. Till the forgetfulness is there, our mind is calm, and in that calm mind, the happiness of our true self has been reflected and it has been experienced. So when we wake up from the deep sleep, again there arise the gross body consciousness and the desires of sensory objects, and our mind becomes agitated and unhappiness has been experienced. So if at all we have to experience the permanent happiness, what we have to do is we have to know our real nature of our true self. So when we are living, we talk. But when we die, we don't talk. Why? That means we are the talkers. And when we are living, the talker is there. And when the talker leaves the body, so the dead body remains there. And the talker has left. That means our real nature is talking. We are the talkers. For talking, there is the necessity of understanding. There is the necessity of consciousness. And the consciousness has given up the gross body, and there is no happiness at all. So the happiness is in our true self, which is of the nature of consciousness. We are not at all the gross body, but we are the true self, and that true self is of the nature of happiness. So we salute to the imaginary beings so that they can give us happiness. We salute to the sensory objects so that they can give happiness. But there is no happiness in the form. That which has form, it is of the nature of unhappiness. And if we salute to the imaginary beings which have form, And if we salute the sensory objects also have a form. And those which have form, they give us unhappiness. So our self has no form. And somebody, what they do, no? So those which have form, they give us unhappiness. And they will be in a position to concentrate on the sky. Sky has no form. So the sky should be in a position to give us happiness. But the so-called sky, it is insentient. And that which is insentient is not in a position to give you happiness. But our true self, it is sentient. It is consciousness only. But generally, what the people do, they will be in a position to chant the verses like that. Om Namo Sukaya. And the others will be in a position to chant the verse Om Namo Narayanaya. But the real meaning of Shiva is bliss, happiness. And the real meaning of Narayana means the aim of man. Naranama Narayana. The aim of man is also bliss only, happiness only. But what the ignorant people do, they imagine that Shiva is one God and he has one form. And another, Narayana, other God. So Narayana is other God and he has a different form other than Shiva. Then the ignorant people, what they do, Shiva is our God and he is great. Narayana is others God and he is not great. Like that, the ignorant people have been in a position to quarrel. And when this quarrel stops, so when we give up the imaginary forms, Shiva, Parvati, Lakshmi, like that. So they are all forms. And when we give up the sensory objects, and they have also a form, when we give up the form, we will be happy. And our consciousness, our real nature, it has no form. So that's how, if at all we have to be happy, we have to salute to our real nature, that is the true self. And the true self has no form. In deep sleep also, there is no form. There is no form in deep sleep, but there is happiness. There is happiness because there is our true self. So our true self has no form and there is happiness. If at all we have to get permanent happiness, so we have to salute to our real self, that is Om Namo Nanave, Om Namo Sukaya. Sukha or the happiness has no form at all. And if we have to experience permanent happiness, we need not quarrel for forms. Shiva, Parvati, Lakshmi, Ganesha, like that. And we should not quarrel for sensory objects, because the sensory objects have also the form. So that which has a form gives unhappiness. That which has no form, it gives happiness. And some, what they do, the sky also has no form. And they will be concentrating on the sky so that it will be in a position to give us happiness. But sky is insentient, and the insentient gives us unhappiness. So that object which has no form, that entity which has no form and which is sentient, that would be in a position to give us happiness. And our own true self is of the nature of happiness. Our own true self has no form and it is sentient. It is not insentient like the sky. So there is no necessity to concentrate on sky to experience permanent happiness. So that is how, if we salute to our true self, which is of the nature of happiness, so that is Om Namo Nanave. Om Namo Nanave means salutation to my real self. So these two verses have been contributed by His Holiness Atmananda Swamiji. So when the mind becomes calm, so there is no body consciousness. There is no understanding that I am body. And there will be no sensory objects, desires of sensory objects. In a deep sleep, so there is no gross body consciousness. There are no desires of sensory objects. But there is a bliss consciousness. So when there is bliss consciousness, bliss is experienced. And when there is gross body consciousness, gross body is experienced. When there is a sensory object consciousness, only sensory objects have been experienced. So if we remove the gross body consciousness and the sensory objects consciousness, and if we will have the bliss consciousness, we will be in a position to experience the permanent bliss. Then only the quarrels which have been resulted for the sake of forms or for the sake of sky, so all of them will be stopped. So these two verses, Om Namaha Sukaya and Om Namo Nanave, so these are not for chanting them. Om Namah Sukaya, Om Namah Sukaya, Om by the mind, Om Namah Sukaya, Om Namah Sukaya. Not for that. But these verses are not for concentrating on them. So we will be in a position to write the mantra, Om Namah Sukaya, and we will be concentrating on it. So these verses have been contributed by His Holiness Atmananda Swamiji for reflecting the meaning of these verses. Om Namah Sukaya, that means Sukaya has no form, and we need not quarrel for the forms, for the imaginary gods and goddesses, for the sensory objects, and we need not concentrate on the sky, because the sky is insentient. Though it has no form, it will be in a position to give us unhappiness only. If at all we have to have permanent happiness, so we have to understand that our true self has no form. Our true self is not insentient, but it is sentient. Shankaracharya explains, Chidananda Rupa Shivoham Shivoham Manobuddhya Hankara Chittani Nam Nacha Srotra Jivve Nacha Grana Netre Nacha Vyoma Bhumirna. That means Chidananda Rupa Shivoham Shivoham. Shiva means he has no form, formless. Chidananda. So God is that which has no form. God means consciousness, understanding. And we are of the nature of consciousness. So we are gods. We are gods and goddesses. And we are of the nature of permanent happiness. So why we have to adore the imaginary gods and goddesses and salute them? And why we have to salute to the sensory objects which have forms, and all of them have been in a position to give us unhappiness only. So the bliss has no form. For example, in a deep sleep there is no form. There is no any object which has a form. So everyone knows that, everyone knows bliss. And everyone knows misery. For example, when we will be in a position to enjoy the ice cream, so our mind becomes calm, and in that calm mind, the happiness of our true self is reflected and experienced. And even all of us know that when we will be in a position to catch the fire, so it will be burning our fingers. That means misery also we know. Happiness also we know. Misery also we know. So there is the first intuition. So in the beginning, there was only consciousness. The first known experience of all beings is happiness. And that happiness is consciousness. And there was only consciousness. And in that consciousness arose, I am consciousness. The consciousness itself was there. But it was not in a position to know that it was consciousness. So in that there arose, I am consciousness. The consciousness came to know that I am consciousness. So this is the first and foremost experience of all living beings. And this first intuition has been somehow forgotten. So in this forgetfulness, there the world had been created. Many gross bodies and many other beings and many other sensory objects like that. And later we were in a position to know that the world was created, and there the body also was created. So we came to know that I am this gross body. And these sensory objects are givers of happiness. And the cause of unhappiness is the sensory objects are givers of happiness. and I am the gross body. And if at all we have to experience permanent happiness, so we have to transcend the idea that the happiness is there in the sensory object. We have to know certainly that there is no permanent happiness in sensory objects. And again, when we are in body consciousness, gross body consciousness, in a deep sleep, there is no gross body consciousness. When we awake, there comes the gross body consciousness. I am this gross body. What you have prepared to eat or for a drink like that. And there will be hunger, there will be thirst, cold, bright sunlight, sultriness, insult, disease, old age, desire, and fear of death. So when there will be gross body consciousness, there will be unhappiness. When there will be desire for sensory objects, there will be unhappiness. But when there will be consciousness, that understanding that I am consciousness. So in that understanding, we can only experience the permanent happiness, unmixed with misery. So if at all we have to experience permanent happiness, we need not quarrel for the forms of imaginary beings. Shivaya Namaha, Ganeshaya Namaha, Lakshmi, Parvati, like that. But we can salute, we can give respect to our true self. Om Namah Sukaya. Our true self has no form, and we need not quarrel for that. Though the sky has also no form, but it is insentient. So we have to leave the sky, and we have to understand that our true self is of the nature of happiness, and it is of the nature of consciousness. So we have to think that only in our true self, that is consciousness, there is happiness. And happiness is not in imaginary beings or in sensory objects or in gross body consciousness. And we can, if stand still in our real self, we will be permanently happy without the mixture of misery. So that is how. So these two verses, which have been contributed by Atmananda Swamiji. So we have to reflect. If we merely chant them, Om Namo Sukaya, Om Namo Nanave, it is of no use. We have to understand that our true self is of the nature of happiness, and it has no form. So don't quarrel for forms. Shiva, Narayana, like that. Parvati, Ganesha, like that. And even the sensory objects have form, and they give us unhappiness. So you need not salute to these sensory objects. So these verses are only for understanding that the happiness is in our true self, which has no form and which is sentient. And if we, and these mantras are not for chanting. These mantras are not for concentration on them, but these mantras are only for reflection. That happiness has no form, and our real self also has no form, and permanent happiness is in our true self, but permanent happiness is not in the sky or concentrating on it, but for understanding purpose, for the purpose of reflection. Reflect it. You try to understand it. For understanding purpose only His Holiness Atmananda Swamiji has contributed these two verses, Om Namah Sukaya and Om Namo Nanave, so that the quarrel for imaginary beings and the quarrel for sensory objects and the ignorance that the gross body gives us happiness have to be stopped. And by this I end my talk.